Hey everyone, Ken and Prophet here. Welcome back to another Blender tutorial. In this video, we're going to make icicles in geometry nodes. So fully procedural, you'll be able to just draw a curve and grow icicles and make some kind of frozen icicle animations, all 100% procedural inside of Blender. So let's jump into a new Blender scene and check this out. Inside of Blender, we'll go ahead and press A to select everything and X to delete. And we're going to add in a curve. So many of my tutorials start the same way. And with that curve selected, go into geometry nodes and we'll go ahead and close out the spreadsheet, and I'm just going to create a new geonodes network. Now, before we actually work on the group input, we want to go ahead and kind of model our initial icicle that can be used to instance along our curve. So whatever curve we draw or manipulate in the viewport, we want to be able to have those nice icicles sort of hanging from the curve. So let's go ahead and create that with a curve line object. So I'm going to press Shift A inside my GeoNodes network and create a curve line. And then if I Control Shift click view that, you see we have a nice curve line. Points is fine, but we can have it just go the opposite direction on Z. So let's flip that +1 to -1, and now it's going that away, which means the pivot point is up here now, and that'll just help it make it easier to sort of make a hanging icicle. Okay, and now let's go ahead and add a trim curve node right after this, and this allows you to now get this start and end slider where you can, if you want to do like a animation of the icicle growing, you'll be able to do that. But then you can further extend sort of the size of this. If you, maybe let's go -10, something crazy. That would be like the longest icicle that you would make. And then you have this slider here, you know, up to you. You could play with these numbers, but that's going to work pretty well for our purposes. Halfway, there you go. Let's give this curve some radius. So I'm going to do a set curve radius node, curve radius, and drop that in right there. And then we'll need a curve to mesh node after that set curve radius. And then obviously we need a profile shape here for that circle curve. So we're going to just drop in a curve circle. And now that is the profile curve shape right there. And if you drag out the radius, then you can see we have a nice tube here. But we want this to actually be, I'm going to just knock this down to radius of about 3 for now. We want this to actually utilize the length of the curve, be thicker up here at the top and skinnier at the bottom. And we can get that with the spline parameter factor length. So if we drop in a spline parameter node, so if we Control Shift click and view our curve and then Control Shift click view the factor of that curve, you can see this nice black to white value gradient here. And that's just the length of the curve factor that we can utilize for the curve radius. So basically if we just take this into the radius of that set curve radius, then and view the curve to mesh, then there you go. We have the exact opposite of what we need, but thanks for watching. All right, so we just need to reverse that, and it's very easy to reverse that. We can just drop in a color ramp node. You can do a mapping node, but color ramp works, and we'll just switch these around. There you go. Now it's remapped. This is much too thick, so let's go ahead and take that radius down a good bit. And then we also want to sort of use this color ramp to kind of remap the shape, but it's not going to give us much unless we resample this curve. Right now this curve doesn't really have much geometry, so let's go ahead and do a resample curve node, and let's crank this up. We'll go something like 25, and now if we view that, you see we have more geometry in here, and we can kind of draw out a shape using this color ramp node, and you can, you know, so play with that and you can make some fun icicle shapes. Maybe it doesn't look like much, but it'll grow, you know. We'll get some more noise in there later on. Right now what we can do is go ahead and triangulate this just to get a little bit more interesting topology in there. I always like to triangulate it anytime I'm doing procedural geometry. The cool thing about this icicle is we have this trim curve node, so you can make a nice animation. So how do we instance this guy on our curve that we drew up here? Well, I am glad you asked. What we can do is with this curve, do a simple curve to points node. And now we have points. We can set this from count to length. And now we have a bunch of points depending on the length of our object. All right, so now we have this factor. And if we slide it up, we can get less or more depending. But this number is too small to kind of work with. So let's go ahead and add in a math node. We'll set this to divide, and we'll just drop that into that length factor right there, and I'll divide this by 10. And now this bottom value right here, this just gives us a number that's a little bit more manageable, and it also goes from smaller to larger instead of the other way around because we divided it. So now we could take this output and feed it into our group input node later on, and that would be helpful for our tool. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. We'll take this output and go right into group input, press N, bring up the sidebar, and I'll just say amount. I'll set this to amount. And so now we have a factor slider here for the amount of icicles on our curve. Okay, pretty cool. And now we also have just points on our curve, and points are great because you can instance things on points. So let's drop in an instance on points node, and the instance on points is takes this points input, and then it also wants something to instance. Well, we made this icicle, so we can instance this icicle on our instances, and now we have icicles instanced. Over here in the amount, we can crank up the amount of icicles we have on our curve. These are all much too uniform, so let's break up the scale and the rotation of them. So we're going to do random value nodes here. This one can be a float value because it's just going 0 to 1. So let's go 0.1 to 1.5, let's say, and feed that into the scale. Let's just do 1. There you go. 0.1 to 1 into the scale. Shift-T, duplicate that. This time let's do a vector value because this gives us x, y, z, x, y, z. So we'll feed that into the rotation, just a little bit of rotation, whatever you want. Something small on the x and the y. And then on the z, you can spin it infinitely. It doesn't really matter with this because they're all cylinders, but it will break up the silhouette a little bit, at least. Give you something slightly different. All right, and so now you're seeing kind of the randomization if we crank up the amount. There we go. And this is totally responsive. So if you have grabbed that Bezier curve and you want to edit it, fully procedural, and you can extrude, and it should be very responsive to whatever you're doing in the viewport. All right, now we want to add a little bit of detail to these. And the way we do that is with some noise, but we can also remesh this object to look a little bit more realistic. Now, remeshing typically slows things way down, so we want to build out the option to toggle between a remeshed version of the icicles and just this regular kind of tubes. Because if you're doing something far away, this is about as good as you need. You don't need much higher resolution than that. But if you want to get up close to these things, you want the nice remeshed version. So I'll show you how to do both. The first thing we need to do is we need to realize these instances after we instance them. And that takes it from being one single object to a bunch of individual objects that can then have their own sort of set of noise applied to them. And once that's done, what we want to do is take all of this into a volume. So we're going to drop in a mesh to volume node. Now make sure you save before this because sometimes Blender crashes.
So you can see that that does a pretty good job converting our geometry into a volume. And we want to fiddle with these settings. I'm actually going to use size. But now let's go ahead and convert that back to a mesh by doing volume to mesh right after that, so we can kind of see what we're getting. So the density, I'm going to crank this up to 10, and the voxel size, let's go 0.1, And you can see that that starts to get some nice drippy melted icicles here. In the interior bandwidth, we can turn this down as well. I'll go 0.1 on that. And the voxel size, I might cut even more to 0.05 just to get a little bit higher of a resolution. This is all, you know, to taste. Your numbers are going to be a little bit different depending on what you're working with. And you can see there, we just get something that looks a lot more like ice. These points get welded together. And I do want to mention, you want to make sure that over here at the beginning, I don't know if I talked about this, but if you don't have this right here in the curve to mesh, make sure that fill caps button is clicked, because that'll just enable, if I view what we're doing on our icicle here, without that, it's just an open. And then with that, that really that's pretty essential for the remesh. So make sure you have that clicked. And you can increase the adaptivity or decrease it depending. Also, you can increase the threshold, get a little bit of a smoother look, or turn it down, you know, gets crunchier. Up to you. You can also, there's this size amount here if you want to play with the actual voxel sizes. All up to you. Now, I want the option to not have this remeshed, because the remesher does take a little bit of time, especially once you add subdivision surface on there. So let me finish building out how we're going to do this. I'm going to triangulate this geometry just to get a little bit more in there. It's kind of ugly geometry. Also going to do a dual mesh node, which does its own sort of remeshing. Yeah, they're ingons, but you don't have to do this, but I just kind of like it. I think it displaces better when you add the noise. So I like to do that. And then I like to put everything into a subdivision surface node. And you can see it's starting to look pretty nice once we do all that. These icicles are nicely melted together. It's something like ice is very forgiving with a situation like this, so you can really get away with a lot. And before the subdivision surface node, this is where I'm going to do the switch node. Like I talked about, so that we don't have to do the remeshed version of this geometry. So I'm going to feed our remeshed version into the true function of this switch node, connect that up into subsurface. And then everything before our remesher right here, I'm just going to take that into the false node of this switcheroo node. So now when we switch on, we have a remeshed, switch off, and you can call it combined or whatever, high res, you know. Definitely looks better once you do the remeshing, but this just gives you the option if you're building out a tool. So for example, if I give myself some room, I can drag this out and put it into a group input node. And now in this group input combined, and then here in our tool settings, now we have this switch right here that allows us to combine. You know, you could call it remesh, like I said. So then maybe while you're working on your scene, you increase the icicles, you want it lower res, and then you could combine it after the fact. You can see that's looking pretty cool. All right, now let's add a little bit of noise. There's a lot of ways you can add noise here, but I do want to do a little bit of displacement, and I'll use a wave texture. The way we do that is a set position node, and I'm going to feed in a wave texture right here, and I'll just take the color output into the offset. And you can see we are going off in all directions. And that's because we want to displace it by just the normal. And how do we do that? Well, we can multiply this using a vector math node. We can multiply it by the normal of the object. So let's just get the normal of the object. And we can do that with a normal node. And put that right in here and just drop that right into that multiply. And now you can see this is a work of art, a masterpiece. So thanks for watching. Just kidding. At least we're getting displacement along the normals. That's what we want. Shift D, duplicate that multiply node, and that resets everything. And I like to set this one to scale. So now you have just a one single value where you can scale. And this is on the wrong axis. I don't want it on the X. I want this on the Z. And see, I get those nice ripples now. And then the scale I'll turn down to like a 0.1. Or maybe, yeah, so there you go. You can see what I'm getting at. Just sort of the frozen rings as water drips, sort of expands and then freezes, contracts, drips, expands again. Obviously, we don't want it to look like this, but just a little subtle hint of that. So we'll go like a 0.2 maybe. And then I'll turn distortion up. and detail up and detail scale. There, we're getting some nice distortion breakup there. I might go all the way up on the detail scale. That's looking good. And then the roughness I'll crank up a bit as well, just to get some nice sort of hard edges. So now this is still too much, but it gives, I'm able to adjust that with this scale node now. Now I can take this down to maybe 0.02, something a little more realistic. And we can press M on the set position node to view the before and the after. And I think it helps. If we zoom in here, get a little bit of distortion in there. And then if you go crazy and crank up the subdivision, you'll be able to really start seeing it. Just some nice frozen texture in there. You don't want to go crazy. I mean, maybe you do want to go crazy. Don't let me tell you what to do with your icicles. You can, okay, I'm going to stop talking. So that's all the noise displacement we're going to add. You could frame that up nicely if you want to keep your nodes all nice and organized. The last thing we're going to do is just do a set shade smooth node and drop that in. And that takes care of those sort of fragments there. And now we have some nice melted icicles looking pretty cool. Of course, we need an ice material to finish this all off. Let me go ahead and put this subdivision. I'm going to take that into a group input node just so we have control over the subdivision surface of that. So let me name this subdiv. All about, you know, optimizing when you're working. So if you want to uncombine it, take the subdiv off while you're working, adjusting your icicles, you can work at a much higher speed. And then once you get everything the way you want, you know, maybe turn on combine, crank up the subdivision a bit. You know, you get the drill. All these little things to just improve workflow. Okay, so like I said, we want to add a material. So let's drop in a set material node right here after the set shade smooth. And let's go ahead and create an ice material. So new material, and I'll name this ice. And now we can grab that ice material right there in the set material node. The ice material is applied, and you know it's applied because if you give this a viewport shader, there we go, ice. All right, so now let's make a simple ice material. So let's jump into the shading viewport, and I'm in Cycles, and I do have a simple HDR loaded from HDR Haven. I'll put a link in the description to that. But you can see now we just have this principled BSDF with, you know, it's just a white color. And for starters, I want to map a little bit of color going from dark to light here on these icicles. So I'm going to drop in a mixed color node for our principled BSDF. I'm going to set this top color to just kind of a faint hint of a dark blue. Nothing too crazy. This bottom color will be all the way up to white, and I'll just feed that into the principled. And I want a gradient to decide which parts of this mixed color node are using this color and which parts are using the white color. And that's pretty simple. We can just drop in a gradient texture node and take the color of that into the factor. And now you can see if we control shift click and view that gradient, it's just going left to right. That's not what we want. We want it going top to bottom. Well, this is a vector input right here. So we can feed this into a texture coordinate node, and using the generated is actually fine because now what we can do is drop in a vector rotate node and rotate that generated vector along the y-axis. So if we grab that y, we can just give it an angle of 90, and now it's rotated. You can faintly see it there at the bottom. If we move this up on the z, you can see we're able to start carving out that gradient texture. And now after this gradient texture, we can go ahead and drop in a color ramp node to further adjust this. We'll adjust the color somewhere right around there. Let's set this to B-spline, get a softer fall off. And let's feed this into our factor and now view that up. So I actually want to reverse these because I want the white color to be kind of at the bottom and the bluish dark color at the top. There we go. And then we can kind of scale that out with the color ramp node. Just a little hint in there just to give kind of a darker surface up here at the top, dripping down. I find that little bit of breakup, it just helps, just gives a nice touch. All right, now let's make a little bit of noise, and you don't make some noise. You don't need much, but we do want to add just a little bit of bump. So I'm going to give a noise texture scale of 12, and I'll crank the detail up to about 8, and I'll give a little bit of distortion, 0.1 distortion. Okay, and then I'm just going to take that into a normal map node and feed the factor directly into the color of that normal map. And then I can take this and now feed it into the normal of our object here. Now that's far too strong, but we are getting some breakup. I might increase the noise scale of this a bit. And again, this is just to get that nice sort of fractal look you get on ice as it's freezing. But this strength is way too strong. So if we take this down to something like 0.2, that is something that works a lot more realistically. And now we want to start to actually get the glossy and translucency of ice in here. So let's take the roughness down to 0.03. Very little roughness. It should be very glossy, very icicle-y looking. And ice is, frozen water, so there's going to be subsurface. It's, light hits it and it bounces around in there. So let's take the subsurf weight of this up. Let's go pretty high to 0.75. And that will slow render time down a bit, but it will make it look a lot more realistic when you do that. And I'm just going to take the scale of this down to 0.03. The IOR of ice is, I believe, 1.33 on the IOR of ice. I guess there's a range there. I just fact checked myself, 1.33. And now underneath transmission, we want to increase the weight of this a bit. So let's go 0.85 on transmission. And this is really where you're gonna probably change it the most depending on your scene. If you want it to be fully transmissive, really get that classic icicle look, turn it all the way up. And there you get some pretty good looking ice. I like to have just a little bit of that snowy look. So I'll dial it down to maybe like a 0.9, just get a subtle hint of it in there. And then you can play with the coat. I like to give it a little bit of a coat, 0.1, and again, set that IOR to 1.3 and the roughness 0.05, just an ever so slight amount. And then maybe just a hint of a tint in there. Again, up to you, all depends on your scene. So there you go. It's not a super fancy shader, but it is the one we have. It's an ice shader, and this is going to look different in different lighting conditions, different HDRIs. You definitely want to leave yourself the ability to adjust this on the fly as you see fit. But for the most part, this is a setup that will work in a lot of different snowy environment conditions, and it's fully procedural, so you can just throw it on anything. And like I said, crank up that transmission if you want kind of a cleaner icicle frozen look. But there you go, that's the ice shader, clean and simple. And that's it. That's how to make procedural icicles in Blender using geometry nodes. So fully procedural, very customizable. Now you have a way of just very easily, adjusting the amount, and you could just delete all of these curve points. And like so many of my other tools I've made, you can just draw and then edit and adjust. You can change the amount, increase how many icicles you have there. Everything's going to be randomized. I could put a random seed in here. So there's different places where you could grab a random seed value. You could do it on the rotation. You could do it on the scale as well. That's probably the best place to do it. Get some random seed in your scale. So what you would do is just hook that up into your group input node. Do a random seed value right there, and you can slide that around like so. And now you can do combined, get it all meshed together looking like frozen mess. Maybe take the subdivision up, get some nice detail in there. And then of course we already have the material mapped to it, so you just go into rendered mode, and there you have some beautiful nice frozen icicles ready to go, fully procedural. So that's it for this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. If you want to download my working file, you can, of course, head over to Patreon. Thank you to all my Patreon members. I really appreciate you guys. It means a lot to me that you support me and this channel, so thanks so much. Grab this file if you want to do that. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next tutorial.